Okay, so some introductory thoughts on fair use. Larry Lessig once said famously, for certain values of famous, uh, that fair use is just the right to hire a lawyer. An alternative way to see it is that in core areas, good predictions are possible. Fair use is ordinarily a determination that can be made by a layperson acting in good faith with an eye towards transformative use. Scaring people with rhetoric about how difficult fair use is only causes fair use to contract, both practically and legally, since courts often look to custom to inform fair use findings. So many of the exceptions and limitations we've looked at are extremely detailed in an attempt to draw bright lines, causing, of course, many interpretive difficulties of their own. Um, that's more like the approach of other countries and the international system to what's called fair dealing. There's a vigorous debate over whether US style fair use, with its open ended texture, is a good idea. The US dominance in content production and technological innovation certainly speaks well for it. Israel and Hong Kong adopted US style fair use in the last decade. Australia, the UK, South Africa, and Canada have been considering it, and Canada's made some moves in that direction. On the other hand, some have argued that fair use is inconsistent with our international obligations under Berne and TRIPS, though I disagree. The worries arise over the idea that fair use is too broad. It's not limited to certain special cases, as Berne requires. It's too indeterminate, and it may cut into normal exploitation of a work. Plainly, the meanings of normal and unreasonable are at issue, including whether we only look at it from copyright owners' perspectives about what's normal or unreasonable. Consider throughout our discussion the advantages and disadvantages of such a broad and flexible standard for both potential copyright plaintiffs and potential defendants compared to the alternatives. And of course, my bias is I like fair use. I also think that the narrow rules don't actually end up solving interpretive problems, they just generate different ones. But now we're going to talk about theories of fair use. So there are different theories overarching of how you would think about fair use. One primary concept looks for transformation. Some of those cases involve adding new material, but others will involve uses where the context and purpose are different enough to be considered transformative for fairness purposes, even though there's mechanical copies. The idea discussed in Harper and Row of reasonable and customary uses also sometimes plays a role. Uses that appear to be part of background expectations are more likely to be deemed fair. Another competing theory that purports to explain both transformness and custom, and also to deal with changes in technology and practice over time, is called market failure theory. When transactions costs make it too difficult for parties to reach voluntary agreement, an unauthorized use should generally be fair because prohibiting it doesn't encourage the transaction, which isn't going to take place no matter what, and deprives the world of the benefits of the use. When transactions would be simple, unauthorized use is unfair. And vitally, market failure theory posits that courts should make decisions that encourage markets to form where possible by rewarding efforts to create markets with findings of no fair use. So there are several possible types of market failure. First, there are transaction cost market failures, where it's difficult to identify the owner, it's expensive to negotiate licenses, they don't answer your calls. This is likely the easiest thing for copyright owners to change. There are also, however, market failures that come from externalities of unlicensed uses, in particular, positive externalities. So there are many public benefits from parodies, from scholarship, from education that can't be priced to internalize the full cost of the benefits to society, and therefore the entities engaging in them can't pay the licensing costs they'd otherwise be able to pay. Copyright owners probably can't change whether educational institutions can internalize all their benefits. Thus, there will be persistent market failures. It's worth noting that some people also talk about negative externalities. So Justin Hughes has a theory that we benefit from unitary sources of cultural products. Harry Potter should have just one meaning, and we benefit from forcing people not to draw on what's gone before. So maybe there are fair use negative externalities. Third, there are non-market considerations that inhibit bargaining. Now, these are controversially classed as market failures in copyright theory when it comes to fair use. So here are examples of non-market considerations that inhibit bargaining. And these are all actual litigated cases. A politician refused to license his copyrighted campaign music for his opponent's ad. A tycoon bought the copyright on magazine articles and books about him, and then sued a biographer for including quotes from all those magazines, articles, and books. Third, a publisher refuses to license a competitor to use copyrighted magazine covers in comparative advertising, where the advertisement is, "We are better than this other magazine." Ordinarily, refusal to bargain isn't market failure at all. We allow people to price their private property according to their own desires. If you don't want to sell your land to an abortion clinic or a church, you don't have to. So this is maybe not a conventional market failure, but it's a market in which people have varying preferences, and basically to preserve what we think fair use ought to do, market failure theory classes these sort of non-economic reasons for failing to bargain as market failures. So with that background, I want to say a few words about the Sony case. The court identifies two types of non-infringing use at issue in Sony: authorized time shifting and unauthorized time shifting. 7.3% of all use was to record sports events, and the major leagues had no problem with that. One question is whether they'd have the same response today, given the technological changes. And if they did want to control and monetize time-shifted replays, whether that desire would make a difference to the fair use analysis. And you can see how in a market failure paradigm, it probably would. I also want to show the defendant's trial strategy on authorized time shifting. So the main witness here for the defendants on authorized time shifting was the beloved Mr. Rogers, who testified that some stations program the neighborhood at hours when some children cannot use it. I think it's a real service to families to be able to record such programs and show them at appropriate times. So that's the authorized part. We'll discuss unauthorized time shifting in class. Before I leave you, though, I want to introduce a new participant, the Seventh Circuit, which represents another view, supposedly purely fact-based, but in fact deeply normative. So we have Ty versus Publications International, the Guide to Beanie Babies, and also For Love of Beanie Babies. The Collector's Guide. And here's an internal picture from the latter. As you may recall from the derivative works context, Judge Posner distinguishes between complements to the original work and substitutes for them. Complements are transformative and don't infringe. So now that's converted into the fair use standard as well. The result of the analysis for the Beanie Babies books is that the collector's guide is okay because it's a traditional collector's guide. By contrast, it wasn't clear whether For the Love of Beanie Babies was enough of a guide versus something more entertaining, as you see in this 2-page spread. So the court remanded for further fact-finding. The next big Seventh Circuit case is called Kienitz versus Scotty Nation. The facts are these. While a student at the University of Wisconsin in 1969, Paul Soglin attended the first Mifflin Street block party, whose theme, according to Soglin himself, was taking a sharp stick and poking it in the eye of authority. But many decades later, in his 7th term as mayor of Madison, Soglin wanted to shut down the event. For the 2012 block party, Scotty Nation thus made T-shirts and tank tops displaying this image of Soglin's face and the phrase, "Sorry for partying." The photographer sued. The Seventh Circuit began with factor 1, commenting that transformedness doesn't appear in the statute, although the Supreme Court mentioned it in Campbell. Mentioned is sort of like saying WMDs were among the reasons the U.S. offered for war in Iraq, but it sets the tone. The court repeats its own test, now as the definition of fair use, whether the contested use is a complement to the protected work, which is allowed, rather than a substitute for it, prohibited. Where this appears in the statute is left as an exercise for the reader. The key fact, the Court of Appeals thought, was that T-shirts and tank tops don't substitute for the original photographs. The most important factor appeared to be that Kienitz didn't argue that his plans for licensing the work for apparel were disrupted by defendant's use, or that demand for the original or any other use that he contemplated was reduced. The amount taken also mattered here, but somewhat surprisingly. So they started with a low resolution version of the photo. They abstracted a lot of the detail. Um, however, the court also held this against them. That is, it didn't matter that they started with this photo, since almost any photo of the same guy would have achieved the same result. But the court holds that against the defendants because they had no good reason for picking this photo. They could have taken their own photo. The court, of course, assumed that they had access to the mayor to do that. The Court of Appeals distinction between substitutes and complements is mentioned favorably by the Supreme Court in its most recent fair use case, which we'll get to shortly. Consider whether you think you can reliably identify what substitutes for a work and what complements it. And we may discuss that more in